You're watching Reason and Theology Live, a show dedicated to charitable discussions, debates, interviews, commentary, and analysis. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back. We are doing a second show for the day. Your host, Michael Lofton, joined by John DeRosa from Classical Theism, returning to the show. How are you, sir?
Michael Lofton, I am a big fan of the show. I'm doing well, and it's a pleasure to be back on. Thanks for having me.
It's been a while, hasn't it?
It has, but I've been watching a lot of your content, and yeah, it's always a pleasure to be on.
Thanks. I appreciate you coming on. And we're talking about your book here. This one is published by Catholic Answers Press, One Less God Than You, How to Answer the Slogans, Cliches, and Fallacies That Atheists Use to Challenge Your Faith. This is fun stuff. How did you get into apologetics with atheists?
Well, believe it or not, I have been interested in these discussions for quite a while because I was in college when the new atheism was at its peak. Like Dawkins wrote God Delusion in 2003, and then I was in college from 2008 to 2012. Christopher Hitchens actually came to our campus at the College of New Jersey to do a debate against Frank Turek. So that's kind of when I was just thrust into all these sorts of questions, which I had always been a Catholic all my life, but wasn't really forced to think about until I went to a public university and was confronted by all these ideas. But that was kind of my inroads to it. And I'm really thankful because we had a great priest on campus. I love to mention him in interviews, but Father Bill, and he taught us the intellectual side of the faith as well as the prayerful side and got us into that. But that was my first exposure. And then ever since then, I've been kind of accumulating these slogans that get thrown around and used in conversation. And originally I gave this away as an ebook, but then Gary Machuda encouraged me to, write it up even further and collect even more of them and put it into a full-length book, because so many people get into conversations about religion, about atheism, about Catholicism, and they don't know what to say when these like one-liners just kind of come at them. And so I kind of wanted to give Catholics some of the tactics, strategies, and, just skills to have a better dialogue when these things are brought up in conversation. So that's kind of the genesis. And then eventually, in 2020, I wrote that book.
One Less God Than You. Yeah, that one comes up a lot. Let's start with the title. Why is that a problematic argue? Hey, I'm an atheist. I just believe in one less God than you do.
Yeah, and it usually comes with a bit more of a story, like, well, hey, you don't believe in Zeus, you don't believe in Odin or Thor, you don't believe in 2,999 other gods. I just go one God further, and to be consistent, you should do the same. I just believe in one less God than you do. And the main tactic, Michael, that I present in the beginning of the book, after I just give some general strategies like, hey, pray every day about these conversations so you can be more charitable and have better dialogues, is that I say you should ask questions rather than make statements. So even if someone comes out with a slogan that you're like ready to hit a home run on because you've heard it 100 times, try to pose it as a question first to get them thinking about it. So one thing I like to ask someone who makes that remark about, I just disbelieve in 2,999 other gods. And why don't you just go one God further? And I like to ask them, well, hey, do you think all those gods are the same? And if so, why? Or what would make them different? Another thing that commonly gets thrown around with this too is, belief in God is just like Santa Claus or the flying spaghetti monster or other things that we've kind of put behind us as we've moved onward. And I think by asking that question of, do you think all those gods are the same? You can get them to reflect on what kind of conception of God do they have in mind? And are they denying when they're an atheist? Because I might say, I disbelieve in those gods too, but the God that I worshiped is not a finite material deity that's living in the world that, has emotions and can just like blow his gasket like Zeus does and has all kinds of romantic relationships and things of that sort. What we're getting at is the God of classical theism, who's the creator of the whole show. And so there's a fundamental and a qualitative difference in kind between those other gods that you're mentioning and the God of classical theism. So I might ask that question to try to get those differences on the table. Another little anecdote I tell in the book is just to kind of get them thinking of why this is not good argumentation in general. Is like, let's say you're at a parade or something and there's a theft committed where a necklace is stolen, and the police round up a bunch of suspects and they try to, nab one of them for being the thief. And they interrogate like 10 or 12 or 15 people, and none of them seem to be the person that stole the necklace. And, if you're in that detective bureau and you're talking amongst the officers, and one of them just pipes up and is like, well, hey, it was not, any of these 10 to 15 guys. Maybe there just is no thief. I just believe in one less thief than you do. And therefore, maybe no one stole the necklace. You kind of see that that's kind of a problematic argument to make and problematic reasoning, because just because the 15 people that you investigated weren't guilty doesn't mean that there was no thief. So just because there's perhaps lack of evidence for some gods doesn't mean that there's no evidence for any god. And so those are some of the suggestions I would make to respond to that.
When I hear I believe one less God than you do, it's kind of along those lines with a thief. I immediately think of somebody who just says, well, we both have cars, but I just have one less engine than you do. Okay, well, you don't have the very fundamental thing that makes up a car, so the whole thing is useless. Well, I don't have a God that is an explanation for the entire universe. Okay, well, then you don't have an explanation for the entire universe. That's a pretty big deal. So it's not just one less God. It's a claim that I don't have an explanation at all, in the same way that it's not that I just have one less engine than you. It's that you don't even have a car, really. Not a functioning one, at least.
No, that's a good point. And one of the things I try to make clear on the podcast, the Classical Theism podcast, and in the book, is who is the God that we're defending? When we call ourselves Catholic Christians, or even classical theists more generally, we're not talking about someone. And that's why it's not on par with Santa Claus or the Flying Spaghetti Monster or other things that you hear. And we'll get into some of the more serious slogans, because I don't just treat the popular ones that, are kind of superficial. We get into some of the serious ones too. But the kind of God that we worship is, as you said, the ultimate explanation of reality, the source of all other reality, the metaphysically necessary foundation for existence, who stands outside of creation as the author, but is also intimately involved, yet is not just one character in the story. When you're reading Romeo and Juliet, okay, Shakespeare is not just one other guy alongside them giving a soliloquy. He's the author of the whole show. And that's an analogy for how we can conceive of God as the ultimate cause and author of creation.
Talking about cause and author of creation, is there evidence for this? Is there evidence that God exists effectively?
And that's actually the first slogan I tackle in my book, because that's what you're going to hear. There's just no evidence that God exists. And Michael, when I wrote this, one of the beginnings of writing this book is I was in a confirmation class, and I was like the small group leader, and it was a confirmation retreat. And students were getting ready to make their confirmation. And some of the students in this group, 9th grade confirmation we do at my parish, actually had these objections. And they were giving these slogans themselves. Either they had heard them in school, or they themselves were questioning things. And one of the things one of the students kept saying is, well, there's just no evidence for God. I would believe in him if there was evidence, but there's no evidence for God's existence. We have science. There's a ton of evidence there. There's just no evidence. And so when someone says that, and I will get into the evidence in a second, I again pause, ask a question. You want to have better dialogues. You got to learn to listen and hear where the other person is coming from, and also try to get a little bit of a barometer on how much they've studied. And by asking this question, which I learned from Trent Horn, you can kind of size up where they're coming from. And all you have to do is ask them. They say, hey, John, there's no evidence for God. You ask them this, well, hey, what's the best evidence you've heard for God's existence? And what do you think is wrong with it? What's the best evidence you've heard? What do you think is wrong with it? Immediately, then you're going to be able to kind of categorize what they say. They might just say, oh, well, I've never heard anything at all. Nothing. There's no evidence because he doesn't exist. And then you can say some of the things I'll get to in a moment. Or they might have some sort of like weaker or subjective evidence, like, well, I prayed for something once. I heard my friend said he prayed for something once and it came true, so that's why he believes in God. Or, some people really think they have a religious happy feeling when they go to church and stuff, so that's why they believe in God. And if they bring up that kind of evidence, you could say, well, yeah, I kind of see why that's some, perhaps weaker or subjective evidence that wouldn't convince you, but have you considered anything else? And see what they've done. Or perhaps you're going to be talking with someone who has their homework. So the three categories I'm trying to lay out is either they just dig in their heels, they say there's no evidence, or they offer some like weak evidence, subjective feelings, things that they've heard, anecdotes, or they kind of show that they've done their homework a bit and they say something like, well, I've heard the contingency argument for God's existence, but I think it commits the fallacy of composition, because just because all the small bits of something are contingent, it doesn't follow that the whole show is contingent. So therefore, the universe itself could be necessary. And if someone says something like that, I would compliment them immediately, especially given the fact that discourse on this ultimate question of God's existence has been so like heated and marred by sloganeering and yelling back and forth in the days of the new atheism. I would compliment that person for doing their homework. And then you can kind of get into the contingency argument. And if you have a good answer to that objection, you can offer it right there. But that's the first thing I would say, Michael, is ask them, have you ever considered any of the evidence? What's the best evidence you've heard? And what do you think is wrong with it?
What do
Now,
you say?
go ahead. I was going to get to the evidence, but go ahead.
Well, but I guess before we do that, unless this is where you're going next, could you briefly answer what do you say to somebody that says, well, just because you have basically the objection that you just gave, what would be the answer to that?
The contingency argument?
Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes the contingency argument goes along the lines of saying, well, there's a lot of contingent beings in the world. The universe itself seems to be made up of contingent things. And if the universe as a whole is contingent things point outside of themselves to a cause for their existence. And so what this argument is getting at is there has to be a cause outside of what's contingent. And you can't just have contingency all the way down, because then you would have things pointing to explanations, but nothing would ever be ultimately explained. And we could talk about infinite regress in a second. So you would have to have some necessary foundation, some necessary explanation or necessary cause in order to explain that which is contingent. So that's one way a sketch of the argument might unfold. But what they're challenging is this idea that, well, hey, just because the bits of the universe are contingent doesn't mean the whole show is. That's a fallacy of composition. So they argue. Here's the response. Fallacy of composition is actually an informal fallacy, which doesn't mean that it holds in all cases. In some cases, it's illegitimate to infer that just because the parts of something have a particular property, therefore the whole has a particular property. But in some cases, it is legitimate to infer that. So we kind of have to look at the details and figure out what kind of case we're dealing with. From the fact that each part of an elephant is really small. If you were to chop up the elephant into like inch-sized cubes, you shouldn't do that. That would be grotesque. But each part is really tiny. Therefore, the whole elephant is tiny. That reasoning doesn't follow. Bertrand Russell famously uses this example. Just because every human being that you know has a mother, therefore all human beings have one mother, that doesn't follow. But consider different examples. If every brick in a wall is red, therefore the whole the whole wall would be red because it's built up of red bricks. So in that case, the inference is good to say that the redness of the one brick can go out to the redness of the whole. And so when you're considering a contingency argument, you'd have to get into, well, what are the reasons behind thinking that there are contingent beings? And could we think that everything is contingent? And I think what you have to get to is noticing that contingent beings point outside of themselves to a cause or to an explanation for why they exist. That's what makes them contingent. And so if you have one contingent thing that's explained by another, that's explained by another, that's explained by another, and then you consider the whole show and you wonder, could it just be contingent things all the way down? You have to kind of ask yourself, well, hey, yeah, does that seem intuitive to you? Or does it seem more analogous to the case? And this is where people bring up different kinds of illustrations. And I think I use this one in my book, where it's kind of like a chandelier, where one link is being held up by another, which is being held up by another, which is being held up by another. Would it make sense to say that the whole chandelier is being held up by an infinite number of links, or that it's just a bunch of links holding together? would that make sense on its own? Or do you need to posit something firm outside of the chain of chandelier links, something that's necessary that accounts for the whole of them? And so what I would say is with the universe case, we have things that we can point to and that we can analyze, such that the fact that it seems to have begun to exist, that it seems to have certain constants and quantities that were fine-tuned regarding it that didn't have to be the case, to the fact that it seems to be expanding in its size and so on. These different features that we can point to seem to make it more like the red brick case, where you build up a bunch of red bricks and you don't have contingency of the whole. Just because the bits are contingent, it seems that the whole thing has to be contingent. It seems to be more like that case than it does to seem to be like the case of the pieces of the elephant, or the Bertrand Russell case of the mother and the whole there. So you'd have to kind of get into the details, but as you could see, this stuff gets kind of complicated, and that's why I'm going to compliment that person who comes right out there with that objection.
Yeah, it's better than the flying spaghetti monster one for sure. So one thing that we often hear in these discussions is a mentality that pretty much assumes that the study of the natural sciences exclude belief in God. What would you say to somebody who would, effectively assume that science excludes belief in God?
Yeah, so I would start with a question, because this is a big one that comes up, especially among millennials and Gen Z. They think that in order to be a religious person or to be devout, that you have to kind of give up science, and that you can't, be a strong supporter of science. And I want to break that. I want to say that that's not the case. I want to say we could be Catholics and we love science. But I would still start with a question for somebody who poses that. I want to ask them this before you jump into it. There's a lot of great talking points we can hit about how there were many Catholic scientists who did a ton of great work. We could also bring up the idea that, well, hey, the intelligibility of the world and science itself requires that things make sense, which points to a creator. And we could talk about a bunch of other cases and things of that sort. But before I even get to any of that, I want to ask this person, here's the question I like to ask. Well, hey, what exactly is the incompatibility you see between believing in God and believing in science? Because I'm a Catholic and I love science. And just let them talk, because people have different issues on their minds. And unless you ask that question, you're not going to be 100% clear on what's in their head. So that's how I start out. What's the exact incompatibility you see between believing in God and believing in science? And I pose that question in the chapter, and then I get into like 5 of the common issues of why people think that science is inconsistent with God. But I'll kind of just throw that out there, Michael. What do you think about that? Do you want me to get into some of the specifics, or maybe you can even offer what you think are some popular or common responses?
I'm nowhere in that area as good as you are. So maybe if you could give us some more specifics.
Well, to be honest, the most common one, you know what you're going to hear is that, well, listen, science points to evolution. And the Bible says that the world was created in 6 days. So therefore, the Bible can't work with science. So and therefore, I can't be a Christian, and therefore I can't be a Catholic. But yeah, go ahead.
So it effectively assumes that, scripture and I guess theistic evolution are incompatible.
Exactly. Without argument. They just kind of assume that that's the case. And that's out there with a lot of young people. So I think this is where it's nice to bring up, that the fact that the last 3 popes have spoke very positively about evolution. And we can believe in a God who guided the evolutionary process up to the creation of man, and there's no incompatibility there. In fact, we could point to like great scientists who are also priests. Father Nicanor Austriaco is a great Dominican priest, wrote a book called Thomistic Evolution, and says, hey, you could be a Catholic, you could also be in evolution, believe in evolution as well. So that's not an incompatibility. Do you have any other roadblocks? Because we're kind of removing obstacles for people who want to come to faith. But I'll tell you the second big one is people will say, well, there's no scientific evidence for God. And since, science is really how we get to truth, therefore I can't believe in God because I haven't seen the scientific evidence in favor of him. And so that's like kind of another common sentiment that you'll hear. And what I want to point out there is it just kind of assumes scientism, which says that science is the only way of knowing. And that's a philosophical position that we can question, but we can also acknowledge the scientific method is great. It's great for providing us explanations of natural world stuff and processes, but we can also look to other disciplines to get at truth. There's nothing in science itself, there's no set of experiments that leads us to the conclusion that only science can provide us with truth. You can ask them, well, hey, what's the experiment that shows that only science provides us with truth? There isn't one, because
Mhm.
scientism is false. And then we can point to hey, we can look to logic, we can look to metaphysics, we can consider ethics, history, art, literature. Don't you think there's truth in these fields as well, in addition to science? And so we don't need to limit our scope of evidence simply to science experiments in a laboratory. But, and I'll also acknowledge this, William Lane Craig has pointed out many times, science can provide evidence for a premise
Mhm.
in a philosophical argument that has theological significance. So that's where we could go into George Lemaitre, who is the Catholic priest who
Mm.
fathered the Big Bang Theory, and show that he was pointing to scientific evidence that the universe began to exist. If the universe began to exist, and whatever begins to exist has a cause, this is the cosmological argument, then we get to a conclusion that the universe has a cause, and we can analyze what that cause is like and see if it points to a creator. So there, the science can provide some evidence for a premise. But long story short, science and evolution are not incompatible with Catholicism. And two, science is not the only way of knowing. So science, I would say, doesn't exclude belief in God. And if the person is going to insist that it does, I would just ask them to specify, well, why do you
Mm.
think science shows God doesn't exist? Or why do you think it's incompatible with God's existence?
I vaguely recall Stephen Hawking arguing something along the lines that the universe explains itself in its own origin. What would be the problem with that argument?
Yeah, there is a quote out there. Um, there's another one that's similar. I think like the universe could create itself through some kind
Yeah,
of
something weird. Yeah.
fluctuation, something like that. I think the basic problem is that the idea of something creating itself seems to
Mhm.
be philosophically incoherent, because in order to create itself, it would have to exist prior to itself, at least causally and logically prior, if not temporally prior. So it would be impossible for something to cause its own existence, because in order to cause its own existence, it would already have to exist. So I think we would just say that there's a philosophical error there. Now, where is the science pointing? Maybe there's a difficulty in interpreting what's going on with that beginning of the universe data. And there are a lot of complex theories surrounding that. But we could still use our knowledge of philosophy, common sense, and metaphysical principles to say, well, hey, something creating itself, that's going to be a non starter.
But what would you then say to those who say, "But okay, well, what caused God? Where did God come from?"
Yes, and that is a slogan I deal with in. I got a whole chapter on that. If anything has a cause, then what caused God? And
Mhm.
Ed Feser takes this up in a whole chapter of his book, and I actually consider it more of one of the superficial slogans, because the reply is actually just, well, we never said that everything has a cause.
Mhm.
And when I say the universe can't create itself, it's not that I'm saying, well, hey, we have God over here and God can create himself, but the universe can't create itself because it's like, not good enough. That's not the argument. We're not saying that. What we're saying when we say that God exists as the metaphysically necessary foundation is that he is uncreated. We're
Mhm.
positing this category that there are a bunch of created things, a bunch of contingent things, and these get back to a bunch of the philosophical arguments, a bunch of changing things, a bunch of moved movers, and these are beginnings to philosophical arguments that point back to that which is uncreated, to that which is uncaused, to that which is not contingent or necessary. And so when the question is asked, well, what caused God? We would just say, well, nothing caused God because God was not caused. And we never said that everything has a cause. Sometimes people can hear us saying that when we make a Kalam argument or contingency argument, but we're actually picking out a property of a subset of things that do cry out for a cause, such as whatever begins to exist has a cause. Pick out a subset of things that begin to exist. Well, those point outside of themselves to a cause. Or whatever is contingent has a cause. Or whatever is changing has a cause of when and why it's changing. And so we're picking out some subset of property of things that require causes. But if we get to something outside the set, or something that doesn't have those features, something that is uncaused, which is what we're postulating with the conception of God known as classical theism, well, then the question, what caused God, doesn't really make sense, because he's in a different category than the caused.
When you talk about an unmoved mover, what do you mean by movement and motion? Are you talking about like physical motion, or could you specify that?
Yeah, so you know this as well when it comes to St. Thomas Aquinas and his argument in the first way. He uses motion in more of an Aristotelian sense, where it means change. And so the premise that he employs is not, it's different than the Kalam argument, like whatever begins to exist has a cause. But he says whatever is being changed is being changed by another. And he analyzes change in terms of actuality and potentiality. And so you can get all complicated into the scholastic metaphysics, but whatever is in a state of actual, or whatever's being changed from potentiality to actuality must be done so by something that's already in a state of actuality. And that's how they would state that causal premise. So when we talk about moved movers, we're talking about things that are being changed. Classic example Aquinas uses, like your hand, and you start pushing something with a stick and you move a stone. The stone is being moved. The stick is being moved by your hand, which is being moved by your muscles, which are being flexed thanks to neurotransmitters, and so forth. You can follow that chain down deeper and deeper into reality. But since when we have that kind of chain, we call it essentially ordered causal series. If you have a certain kind of chain like that, Aquinas argues, and I think successfully, it must terminate in something that is not like the rest of the things in the chain. So if you have a chain of things that are being moved from potentiality to actuality, it's going to have to terminate in something that is already in a state of pure actuality. And ultimately, and you can get into, there are objections to this, but you can get back to another conception of God where he is the purely actual being that moves all other beings, but he himself is not moved. So as you can see, there's been a lot of deep thought about this and philosophical thought. And these are not the kind of conversations where if you're just trying to win on Twitter or a Reddit forum that you can explain in like 3 seconds. Like you got to be talking about someone, with a beer, with a cup of coffee, sit down for an hour and really try to get into the weeds on this stuff.
One thing that you address in the book is the God of gaps and that argument and reasoning. What is the God of gaps reasoning, and is there a problem with it?
Yeah, so sometimes the objection will be that, hey, any evidence you offer is really just God of the gaps reasoning. And so we should ignore it. And so what I want to say is, yes, that the atheist is getting something right here. And one of the other principles I talk about is trying to find common ground. And there is a problematic type of God of the gaps reasoning when it takes this form. I have no idea why X happened, therefore God did it. If that ends up being the final form of an argument, like I have no idea why lightning was produced, therefore Zeus did it. If that is the final form of an argument, that it's not going to be very persuasive and it comes across as an argument from ignorance, and we're not going to go with that either. But here, what I would ask this person who levels this objection is, would you say that all evidence for God requires God of the gaps reasoning? Or do you think that all of the arguments are God of the gaps arguments? And why do you think that? Because I don't think there's reason to suppose that all the arguments are of that type. I brought up the Kalam argument before. I'll bring that up again. In that argument, we're not just saying, oh, we have no idea why the universe began, therefore God did it. If that's all the argument was, if that was the Kalam argument, then William Lane Craig wouldn't be really famous for defending it, and it could be quickly dismissed like this person is doing. But that's not what the argument says. We don't just say, oh, we have no idea how the universe began, therefore God did it. Rather, we're proceeding more cautiously through a philosophical argument where we're pointing towards what we do know about what something must be like, and then we're kind of developing theories around that. In other words, if the scientific evidence supports that the universe began to exist, And if we believe that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and we could talk about that as a philosophical principle, I think it's very plausible. Well, then what we get to necessarily and inescapably is that therefore the universe has a cause. If the universe began to exist and whatever begins to exist has a cause, then the universe has a cause. Now, it's not an argument from ignorance or God of the gaps to say the universe has a cause. And we don't just say God did it after that. We then proceed to unpack what must be true about this cause. What must be the nature of it? And if it caused all space and time and matter, well, then it must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. If it's able to produce something like the universe, it's got to have the power to do so. And it's got to have an eternal power if it wasn't existing in time. And then we can make additional arguments to kind of flesh out, well, hey, do we think this cause was personal? Because it seems that it had to make a choice for the universe to begin to exist. It had to choose to enact that. Otherwise, it's kind of inexplicable why the universe wasn't eternal alongside the cause, why the universe has only a finite time span, unless we posit something like or analogous to a will that could choose to enact the universe, because impersonal forces can't make choices. And so we have to use additional reasoning about what this cause must be like. And if it ends up sounding like God, then we can say this is an argument that points to God. But we're not just saying, oh, we have no idea why X happened, therefore God exists. So that's why I think there's a bad God of the gaps reasoning and we want to avoid it. But then there's other arguments we can make that don't fall into that fallacy.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Yeah, because I've often wondered, I mean, what exactly would somebody say in response to that? Because there are going to be some people who would use that kind of line of reasoning, like you said. Well, Zeus must have created lightning just because we don't know what the source of lightning is, or something like that. Well, just because we don't know how to explain this causality in the world doesn't necessarily mean that God exists. Although I think that you're successfully arguing that there must be an uncaused cause in that argument. So
Well, and
I'm not saying
you'd have to go into the details. That's
yeah,
what I
yeah,
think that
right,
the
right.
slogans are the slogans are just conversation
Mhm.
starters. People like to offer them as if they're like, conversation stoppers. And I
Mhm.
kind of wanted to say this, Michael, if you don't mind, if I could just
Yeah,
go on
yeah.
a quick
No.
tangent real quick, because I think with we're millennials, I would imagine I'm 32 and I would imagine you're kind of around same age-ish as me.
Mhm.
And our generation and even the people younger than us, Gen Z, they love, and I fall into this too, but like we love watching people get owned. And they even call it pwned. And they have all these
Pwned.
words for it. And it's kind of like a pastime. Like watching people get like pwned by like a soundbite, like, oh my gosh, you're getting ratioed on Twitter. And when you think about it, and I was really kind of reflecting on this, thinking about the show tonight. I think as much as we like to watch that, or Gen Z and people younger than us like to watch that, okay, maybe it's entertaining, but then when
Mhm.
they find themselves in a conversation,
Mhm.
I don't think they really are looking to own or pwn somebody else. And honestly, a lot of the time, I don't even think they're that good at it. So what I'm trying to do in this book is to take the slogan, use it as a springboard into a question and a dialogue, which spawns a deeper conversation about the most important things in life. And I think that's gonna be a lot more fulfilling than
Mhm.
just like a real quick ponage on Twitter in the long run, as much as that could be a little bit entertaining. Okay, that's my soapbox. I'm done with that.
It's been a while since I've heard the term pwned. I didn't know they were still using that one. So well, one of the things that I've felt is a pretty strong criticism against theism. Obviously, I don't think it's successful, but I do think that there's some weight to it, at least emotionally. Is that God allows evil? There's evil in the world. You think of things like the Holocaust or other perhaps natural evils in addition to moral evils. Hmm. How could a loving God allow these things, right? And that especially hits us whenever we go through a personal tragedy, right? Something really hits close to home. That's when we really start to entertain or attempt to entertain this objection. What would you say to people who are struggling with that one?
No, and that is the longest chapter in the book, and I kind of phrased it in a way that Dan Barker did in his debate with Trent Horn. which does pull at people's heartstrings and like call to mind things. And he says that anyone who walks into a children's hospital just knows there is no God. Or anyone, and you could just translate that. Anyone who's experienced some terrible suffering, this is what the atheist would say. Well, you just know God doesn't exist. And it's a good argument as far as it's a very powerful argument. There's been a lot of ink spilled on it. And I think we as classical theists, as Catholics, as Christians, need to give it its due. And we shouldn't just be hand-waving or dismissive about it. One initial question you might ask the person is, well, hey, have you considered any of the Christian responses to this? And what did you think about them? Just to kind of gauge where they're coming from. But what I try to do in the book is to make two key distinctions. And we can kind of unravel this as much as you want to. But I first try to distinguish, and you were kind of just getting at this, when the person raises the problem of evil, are they coming at this as an intellectual puzzle? Or are they coming at it as a emotional and pastoral issue, as someone who's going through something right now? And I try to want to discern that first, because depending on where they're coming from, I'm going to answer differently. Okay. And, the intellectual answers and the philosophical answers can come across as a little bit cold for someone who is going through some evil right now. So what I do in the book is I kind of give tips for both of those cases. If someone's going through something right now, I think the first thing is you got to pray for them. All right. Say a prayer for that person silently. Be with them. Help them. The longest book of the Bible on suffering is the book of Job. And when the tragedies to Job happen and his friends show up, they first do the right thing in that they sit with him in his suffering and just be there for him for like a few days. But then they quickly start doing the wrong thing, and they try to like technically analyze why he's suffering and telling that to Job and like giving these explanations for why God's doing this to him. And that's when the book kind of goes off the rails, so to speak, and the friends' explanations are not vindicated in that respect. So your first move should be pray for that person. Someone who's gone through something horrible, they might ask you, well, why did God let my sister get bone cancer and die? Or horrible. I mean, people are dying in shootings, and we're seeing this. Why did someone let this little kid die in a shooting? Why would God do that? I think our initial Christian answer to that, someone who has that real emotional thought, is that after you pray for them, try to get across, and it's not going to be something magical that works in the moment, but just get across the fact that we don't just worship a God who is distant and made the world and walked away, but we worshiped a God who became incarnate in Jesus Christ and suffered himself all the excruciating, terrifying, and terribleness of the cross and betrayal and physical pain. And to be honest, I don't know your suffering from the inside of what you're going through right now, but my Lord and Savior does. And Jesus does know what that's like, and he knows what you're going through, and he knows it better than I do. And I can tell you that he suffered himself, and one day he promises that he's going to redeem all this and make all things new. And I know that's not going to automatically fix what's going on in your life right now, but I would just invite you to talk to Christ, bring your sufferings to him, even if you got to complain to him. Because another thing I do, Michael, I quote in the book, this is all on the pastoral side. I didn't get to the intellectual side yet, but I quote the Bible. I'm a Catholic. No, I quote the Bible. Sorry, no, I don't know if that's shocking. But in Lamentations chapter 3, check this out. I think this could be helpful to someone who's going through the emotional or pastoral problem of evil. The Bible really sanctions grief, complaint, and angst on the part of a believer who's going through something, and they encourage you, take that to God. You don't have to hold that in. He can take it. Christ can take it. He's going to know it better than what we can say. And in Lamentations, it says this, quote, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. So the person says about God, he has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me, he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. This is what the person's saying about God. He has made my flesh and my skin waste away and broken my bones. He has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. He has long made me dwell in darkness like the dead of long ago. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory and my expectation from the Lord. That's Lamentations chapter 3. And what I think that does is it counsels a person. The fact that this is in inspired scripture says that sometimes you got to take your complaints to God, even if they're emotional, even if they're raw. And he would rather you do that and talk to him. And that could be one way of relating to him in that moment of anger and peace. And eventually, oh, not peace, but hopefully he can bring you to that peace. And notice how the prayer ends. I'll just quote a few verses later. The person does eventually have a positive spin on it. They say, quote, "But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end." So even though you might be stricken with some horrible suffering, because of Christ's redemption, we as Christians do have hope of something better, of making all things new. And I would try to get that across to the person a little bit, but I would mostly just kind of be quiet and listen and try to empathize with them and pray for them. Because if someone's really going through something, even the best intellectual arguments aren't going to hold water. So that's the first distinction I would make. And I know I spoke a lot there, but that's what I would kind of counsel on the pastoral side. Does that kind of make sense?
Certainly. And I can definitely say that as strong as there are responses, intellectual responses to this objection, you're right. When somebody's going through something, there's a dichotomy. There's this side of you that says, yes, this intellectually makes sense, but emotionally, I'm struggling with this. So it's a really good point that you make there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, if I want to go further, so then after you distinguish intellectual and emotional problem, and you have some things to say about the emotional problem, have a few things to say about the intellectual issue. If you discern the person actually wants to have a discussion, a lot of people do, either online or in person. They just want to say, hey, well, why does a good God allow evil? And there's where, if you're engaging the intellectual problem, I would subdivide it further between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil. And you can ask the person this question to kind of help subdivide it. Are you saying that evil or some of the evils are incompatible with God's existence, that they made God's existence logically impossible? Or are you just saying that they provide evidence against God's existence and they make his existence unlikely? The first is positing what we call the logical problem of evil. That's a stronger claim that if evil exists, then God cannot possibly exist. And the second, what we call the evidential problem of evil, or the inductive problem, is saying that no, it's just evidence and it shows that either God probably doesn't exist or it's less likely that he exists because of certain kinds of evil. So get where they're coming from there. If they think it's just impossible, the logical problem, I'll tell you what, they have a high burden of proof. You got to ask them to spell out their argument. Why do you think it's logically impossible for God to exist alongside evil? And maybe they haven't along the line, and J.L. Mackie, famous atheist, did make this argument at one point. They might deploy a premise like, well, if there's a perfectly good God, he would eliminate evil as far as he can. And if he's all powerful, then he's strong enough to eliminate all the evil. And if he's all good, then he would eliminate all the evil. And so therefore, there shouldn't be any evil. That's kind of a classical case of a logical problem of evil. But we can question some of those premises. In particular, we can question the premise that a good God would eliminate evil as far as he can. If God is good, then he would eliminate evil as far as he can, or make it so that there is no evil at all. I think we can question that. I think it's a strong claim. So how can we question that? I'll just give you 3 ideas here, and then I'm going to refer people out. You can go to a lot of information on this topic. I think, yeah, I can think of some references in a second. But one, so what would you say to that? Well, if you imagine, God is creating a world where no evil is allowed, he's just eliminating it all as far as he can, you're going to miss out on a lot of the great goods of life. So I would say it's a great good for God to create free creatures who can choose between good and evil actions. And some of the greatest goods in life are relationships that are inaugurated by free choices, which would be absent in a world where there were no morally significant freedom. So that's one point to get on the board. Another point to get on the board. Some other goods are also going to be missing if God just wipes out all the evils or says, he's not going to make a world with any of them. So things like courage, things like compassion, things like forgiveness and self-sacrifice, especially in the face of terrible evils, and not to mention the goods of like redemption and atonement. All of those are going to be absent if God doesn't make a world with any evil in it. And so, what I would say, if they're really putting forth that strong logical problem, is I just don't share that intuition that it's automatically better for God to never make a world with those kind of goods in it. I think it's possible for him to make a world with those kind of goods in it, and those kind of goods can manifest his goodness even better than, like, okay, let's say he created a world with just rocks. I don't know. That kind of sounds kind of boring compared to this magnificent, great story that he has created. So, since that's just one way that we can question the premise. Now, you can get us some other stuff. People will bring up other kinds of evils like natural disasters and bacteria and viruses and cancer and things. And that's where I like to actually say that those can be those can be tied to human free choices as well, in the sense that the fall of Adam and Eve induced a calamity, and we lost our special protection from those natural evils such as disasters, viruses, and bacteria, and so on. So we actually grow up in a world where our first parents sinned, and we experience the horror of what goes wrong when the world doesn't have God and when people turn their back on God. Yet there's a rescue mission, and God is drawing all men to himself, and he's giving them sufficient grace to be saved. So, there is that. But those are some of the things I would point out: the freedom to enter into a loving relationship, the goods that would not be possible in a world without any evil. And also, if you're going to bring up physical disasters and viruses and things of that sort, I would point to the fact that those can be traced to the fall of our first parents in the garden, which partially explains why we now are afflicted by those things. So those are just some of the ways, and there's a lot of things that can be said. Those are some of the ways I would question the logical problem of evil.
You've spoken about the scriptures several times on the show so far. Let's talk about those a little bit. What would you say to those who assume the Bible must be taken literalistically? Because this is something that I think a lot of people assume, especially atheists, whenever they come to the scriptures. What would you say about that?
Yeah, and the way I phrase it in the chapter is like, do you take the Bible literally?
Mhm,
It's
mhm.
often asked you as a question. Michael, I got a survey mailed to me recently,
Yeah.
and it was a very reputable survey company.
Mhm.
And one of the questions said, like, you had to check off agree, strongly agree. Here was the question. It was, quote, as the Bible says, the earth was created in 6 literal days, end quote. And then you had to check off strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree. And I just wanted to tell them the survey's flawed, because they were assuming, as the Bible says, the earth was created in 6 literal days. When someone says, do you take the Bible literally? Or, they ask, do you have to take it literally? I like to
Mhm.
kind of respond with a Bishop Barron question. So I
Mhm.
got this from him, and I think it's a good one. And I just would reply, well, hey, do you take the library literally? And it's kind of a weird question to ask. I mean, the library is like a building. It's got a ton of books. I don't even know what you're talking about. Well, hey, do you take the library literally? It depends what kind of section you're in. And it turns out the Bible is not a single book. It's a library of all kinds of genres and ideas. There's things of, there's saga, there's historical narrative, there's poetry, there's proverbs, there's epistles, there's ancient biographies in the gospels, there's apocalyptic books. There's all these different kinds of genres and styles. And so it doesn't really make sense to say we're going to treat all of them the same way and read them in a wooden literalistic way. It depends what the genre is, what the context is, what the kind of book is, and we're going to interpret it in accord with that context and those tools of language. So no, we don't take the whole Bible literally, in the sense that we don't take the whole library literally. We read it in context. Now, there is something called the literal sense of Scripture. And Aquinas and the scholastics talk about, yes, you want to base your proofs and your doctrine in the literal sense of Scripture, and you always want to figure out what the literal sense of Scripture is. But you pointed out quite correctly, this word literalistically is different from the literal sense of Scripture. And we had
Mhm.
Dr. John Boyle on my show, classicaltheism.com/Boyle. You can get to this episode. He's a scholar of Aquinas and the Bible, Aquinas' commentary on scriptures, and he points out that the literal sense what the commentators and even the patristics do this too. You don't have to get to Aquinas. What they mean by the literal sense is not a literalistic wooden prima facie reading that, okay, you see 6 literal days, you got to take 6 literal days. No, what they mean by literal is taking into account all the relevant tools of language to deem what were the actual realities being denoted by the words of the author. And when they speak, as they do in Genesis, about those days of creation, we have to ask, are these intended to be literal 24-hour days? And are there clues in the text itself that they're not? And I think there are such clues, such that the fact that there's evening and morning on days prior to there being the sun and the moon. And actually, we just read in church recently from the book of Revelation that the ancients knew that the sun and the moon were giving light to things. And so the fact that they don't have the sun and moon created until one of the later days, and yet there's evening and morning in the earlier days, is one clue among many that this may not be a literalistic telling. Perhaps it's a telling of the story of creation, which is contrasting it with a lot of other ancient near myths that say things spawned out of chaos and fighting and darkness and weirdness, whereas we as Christians and Jews, they held, no, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was God, and he created everything. So in a long story short, do we take the Bible literally? Well, you kind of have to ask, do you take the library literally? And then that literally doesn't mean literalistically. It means you take into account all the tools of language, try to get at what are the realities being denoted.
Yeah, well said. What about specific problems that we see in the Bible, such as an implicit endorsement of slavery, at the very least in the Old Testament, or religious wars in the Old Testament? Are those things kosher? How do you interpret those things?
Yeah, and those are also common ones you're going to see online, or people are going to hurl out in slogans like the Bible supports slavery. How could you be a Christian? The Bible supports slavery. Or what about these religious wars? How do they not contradict the Christian message? And so again, I like to start with questions. Remember, I'm not the guy that's like poning everyone on Twitter. I'm going to ask questions, and we're going to get into a dialogue. So the Bible supports slavery. I would ask that person, well, hey, what are some of the Christian responses you've heard to that? And what do you think is wrong with them? Have they looked into this at all? Second, let's say you're right for a second. Suppose the Bible does unequivocally support all kinds of slavery. That wouldn't mean that God doesn't exist, right? That wouldn't mean that there's no creator of the universe or that Jesus is not worth following. At most, it seems maybe your argument would show that there's some difficulties with Old Testament passages. Would you agree with that much? And just kind of check. Maybe if they're being intellectually honest, they would say, you know what? Hey, you're kind of right there. It does poke holes in maybe your theory of inspiration, and maybe your theory that the Bible, cannot err in faith and morals, or that it's completely inerrant. It might poke holes in that, but you're right. It doesn't show that God doesn't exist, that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So that's a fair consideration to get on the table. Those are just kind of some opening moves you might make after you ask them, hey, what have you considered some of the Christian responses? But then, so I call that, by the way, these opening questions in the book, I call it like the opening game. Because if you play chess, I'm not very good at chess, but I do advise the chess club at my school, even though I'm not that great at it. And in chess, there's like the openings, and then there's like the middle game of like how you're going to establish your position after the opening. And I think the opening should be, asking questions, trying to figure out what's going on, what's the person studied, where are you going to go at this? And then in the middle game, you're trying to set out some more specific replies to remove roadblocks that they've put on the table. So another big question to ask with the slavery issue is, have you considered that the word slavery can be used in multiple senses? Have you considered that? Because a lot of people haven't even thought about that. They just saw lists online of like these verses being plucked out of the Old Testament that say like what sounds to them like good things about slavery. Therefore, the Bible's a pro-slavery book. But what's being described in the Old Testament is not the same kind of chattel slavery that we're acquainted with when it comes to the antebellum South in America, where people were kidnapped from Africa, brought here against their will, treated like property, treated awfully. We condemn that kind of slavery, and that's not exactly the same thing that the Bible is talking about. So I want to, get to this different distinctions. So what are some different senses of slavery? Well, yes, you can have that chattel slavery where the person is reduced to mere property, and that's always immoral. But then you can also have some different things. You can have things like penal servitude, where someone in prison or prisoners of war are told to carry out tasks. You could have things like the draft, which we've had, which is a type of involuntary servitude where people are conscripted, perhaps due to the need of self-survival of a small nation, and it's their only way to fight back. And that's a kind of servitude. You can also have a kind of indentured servitude where people sell themselves into debt slavery for a time. They're not reduced to property, but they agree to sell themselves to work off a certain debt that they have that they couldn't otherwise pay. And in the ancient world, that was very common. And it wasn't a means of terror and destroying everyone's dignity. In fact, there were no ancient welfare systems or places that people can go on if they fell on hard times. A lot of times, the best thing someone could do is sell themselves, so to speak, and their labor and their family to work for someone else for, let's say, 5 years, 7 years, and so forth. And that way they could have food, they could have shelter, they could survive and eventually work off that debt. And there had to be that voluntary element because we read in Exodus very clearly that the Mosaic law condemned kidnapping. So it couldn't have been the chattel slavery of the antebellum South where people were kidnapped from Africa, because that was actually condemned and the death penalty was prescribed for people who were kidnapping. So that's not the kind of slavery that was being talked about. And one other point I'd add in favor of this, in Genesis 47, I think it's 47:19, it's the end of the story of Joseph. It's towards the end of the story of Joseph and his brothers. And it's during the time of the famine. And there's a famine. There's a great famine in Egypt. And Joseph, because he had these dreams and visions, knew that this famine was coming and stored up tons of grain and so forth. And the brothers go to him and they plead. This is not something against their will being kidnapped. They ask them, buy us. Let us be your slaves so that we don't have to die of starvation and all kinds of horrible things out there. They actually ask to become slaves, which in this sense, it's really an indentured servitude. So I would say the Bible takes, so that's just distinguishing the different senses of slavery. The other big point to make is you kind of use the word implicit. I would say just because the Bible regulates something doesn't mean God affirms it in an unqualified way. And he's allowed to take a broad or a longer gradual approach to the slavery question, where at first it's regulated. The people are not treated like chattel. They're not even treated the same way as they are in other surrounding societies compared to the Israelite slavery. It was more dignified than some of those other nations. And then eventually, with the law of love in the New Testament, we get Jesus saying, love your neighbor as yourself. We get Paul saying to the slave owner Onesimus, Philemon, the slave owner, to treat Onesimus, his slave, as a brother, not as a slave. Essentially, Paul telling him to free his slave. So eventually we do get there, that slavery is not what's intended. But initially, it's regulated. There's a gradual approach. And eventually, we get to that law of love where it's banned. So it's a much more nuanced question than just something you can answer in 5 seconds. But that's what I would say about the slavery question. And I know we're kind of close to out of time. But for the religious war stuff, once I looked into the actual data, turns out only about 7% of the world's wars were religious in nature. And it's not an argument against religion, unless you want to say, well, hey, is waging a political war an argument against any true politics? Like that just doesn't follow. Like the scholastic adage, abuse does not negate proper use. And just because some people chose to engage in, let's say, unjust wars in certain cases, doesn't mean there's not a proper use of war. And even if some Christians engaged in unjust endeavors, it wouldn't show that Christianity was true, but just they weren't living up to those ideals. So I know we could do a lot on those topics, but that's something on slavery, something on the wars, and I treat them in a little bit more detail in the book.
Yeah, which everybody can purchase. I'll put a link to it there in the description. One Less God Than You by John DeRosa. Tell us a little bit about your channel and where we can go to find more about you.
Thanks, Michael. It's classicaltheism.com. is the website, and you can find it at any podcast you search for the Classical Theism Podcast. And the premise is that we are aiming to defend three core pillars of the Catholic Christian worldview. One, that the God of classical theism exists. Two, that Jesus is our Lord and Messiah. And three, that he founded the Catholic Church. And I don't have any fancy degrees in this stuff. I'm a high school math teacher who's just super interested in apologetics. So to help us do this and defend it, I just bring on a bunch of experts, philosophers, theologians, historians, podcasters, all kinds of evangelists and content creators, whoever I can get my hands on to help us marshal the best case we can for Catholicism. And I'm actually looking forward to it. We're going to be having Michael Lofton on the show not too long from now.
Oh, I'm excited about that. I've really enjoyed your podcast, so it's an honor to come on to it. I remember I was listening to it before I even started R&D. So I've been listening to it for a while. I've greatly enjoyed and benefited from it. So yeah, thank you for all the work that you do. I look forward to coming on your show talking about the Magisterium, and everybody go and purchase a copy of John's book. I assume Amazon would be the best place to go, right?
Yeah, Amazon is great. You can also look at classicaltheism.com/new book. You'll get an offer there on Catholic Answers, where if you wanted to get, because it's good for like a confirmation class, or if you're working with younger kids as well, I think it's very helpful for that. They have like a 5-pack for cheaper. So
Awesome.
if you do, that's at the Catholic.com website, classicaltheism.com/new book. But if you're just getting one for yourself, Amazon's a great way to go.
Perfect. I'll put a link to that as well. Thanks so much for coming on, John. Always an honor to have you on.
Thanks, Michael. It's been a ton of great fun.
Everybody hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, share this on your social media. Go to John's website and check out his book and purchase a copy. And also check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, if you want to get extra access to additional content and support me in what we're doing here at R&T.